Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Hawthornden Lecture Theatre. My name is Lila Risco, and I'm a member of the Modern and Contemporary curatorial team here at the National Galleries of Scotland. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all here today for this event to mark the opening of our newest exhibition, Barbara Hepworth, Art and Life. Welcome also to those of you joining us online via live stream. Barbara Hepworth, Art and Life has opened just this morning in our Modern 2 building on Belford Road, and we'll hear today from the curator of the show, Eleanor Clayton. Eleanor will present for about 45 minutes, after which we'll have time to take some questions. If you do wish to ask a question, may I ask you to please wait for the microphone to be handed to you so that those people joining us via live stream can hear what's being asked. So, allow me to introduce our speaker. Eleanor Clayton is curator at the Hepworth Wakefield and a Barbara Hepworth specialist. As assistant curator at Tate Liverpool, she curated displays around Hepworth's work alongside exhibitions of international modern art such as Mondrian and his studios, Colour in Space, and Nazreen Mohammedi. At the Hepworth Wakefield, she has curated many displays looking at various aspects of Hepworth's work, including Hepworth in Yorkshire and A Greater Freedom, Hepworth 1965 to 75, while bringing Hepworth's work in dialogue with contemporary artists Veronica Ryan, Rebecca Warren, and Felida Barlow, among others. In 2020, she co-founded the AHRC-funded Hepworth Research Network with the University of York and the University of Huddersfield, and she is co-editor of the Hepworth Research Network papers, an open-access online resource bringing together research by artists, art historians, conservators, and curators. Eleanor has published widely on British modern art. In addition to journal papers and reviews, she is editor and co-author of Lee Miller and Surrealism in Britain, and Alan Davey and David Hockney, Early Works. She has also written on Henry Moore's collages for Yale University Press. Her monograph of Barbara Hepworth, Art and Life, published by Thames and Hudson, accompanies the national touring exhibition of the same name, which I am delighted to say is now on show at Modern 2, and it will travel to Tate St Ives later this year. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Eleanor Clayton.
Thank you very much, Lila, and thank you all for coming out today. I hope this will be a nice prelude to then going to see the works themselves at the gallery. And it's really lovely to see the show coming to such a wonderful space and an obviously fabulous city. So Barbara Hepworth is perhaps, before I start, can everyone hear me? Yep. Yes. Excellent. Barbara Hepworth is perhaps one of the most famous British artists of the 20th century, and I'm going to begin this talk with a brief introduction to her work and life. Born in Yorkshire in 1903, Hepworth studied first at Leeds School of Art, where she met fellow student Henry Moore, and then at the Royal College of Art, as you see her here, studying sculpture at a time when the majority of teaching focused on modelling sculptures in plaster or clay to be realised in bronze at a foundry or by a master craftsman or stonemason. Upon graduation, Hepworth went to Italy on a West Riding travel grant where she met fellow sculptor John Skeeping, shown here, who she would go on to marry. Skeeping was undertaking an apprenticeship with Giovanni Ardini, a marble craftsman, and Hepworth joined him, becoming a proponent of direct carving, a process in which, in place of modelling, the sculptor carves directly into their material, keeping complete control over the finished work. So you see here the doves in Parian marble. And Hepworth remembers learning from Ardini, so quote, "It was not dominance which one had to attain over material, but an understanding, almost a kind of persuasion, and above all, a greater coordination between head and hand." When Hepworth and Skeeping returned to London in 1926, they began to build their careers in this field, and their technical mastery over the hard materials of stone and particular woods made an immediate impression on many of the influential art critics of the day. Frank Rutter, writing in the Sunday Times of their joint show in 1930, wrote that it quote, establishes the reputations of John Skeeping and his wife Barbara Hepworth as two of the most important young sculptors, most interesting artists, and the finest craftsmen of the time. He goes on, the Skeepings are carvers, not modellers. Their technical accomplishment is such that they can handle with complete success a great many different and most recalcitrant kinds of materials. And you see here some of the press. Having established herself as a carver with sensitivity to materials and led by materials, Hepworth began quite quickly to develop her work in a different direction, and she wrote of head, which you can see her carving here and there on the right, quote, by 1930, I felt sure that I could respond to all the varieties of wood growth or stone structure and texture. The head, carved in 1930, expressed that feeling of freedom, and a new period began in which my idea formed independently of the block. I wanted to break down the accepted order and rebuild and make my own order. The 1930s were years of considerable change for Hepworth, as her marriage to Skeeping broke down and she met and married another artist, Ben Nicholson, with whom she formed a network of avant-garde artists between Paris and London, including Noam Garbo, Piet Mondrian, and many others. And in this studio photograph, you can see her works alongside those of Nicholson and their experimentations in print, and of course, a baby grand piano in the corner. Hepworth's carved sculptures moved from figurative representations to abstract forms in the early 30s, and in 1943 she wrote to art critic Ramsden of this dramatic, E.H. Ramsden, of this dramatic shift in her work, and she wrote, the torso or figure became the single form. And these are some of the works that she sort of draws little illustrations of in her letter to make this point. The mother and child or group became the two form. She later attributed this shift to the birth of her triplets with Nicholson in 1934, writing, when I started carving again in November 1934, my work seemed to have changed direction, although the only fresh influence had been the arrival of the children. The work was more formal, and all traces of naturalism had disappeared. And for some years, I was absorbed in the relationships in space, in size and texture and weight, as well as in the tensions between the forms. This formality initiated the exploration with which I have been preoccupied continuously since then, and in which I hope to discover some absolute essence in sculptural terms, giving the quality of human relationships. Hepworth's move to St Ives in Cornwall in 1939, prompted by fears of bombings in London at the outbreak of the Second World War, saw colour and string added to her visual vocabulary, additions which she later attributed to her new landscape. And she wrote in 1952, quote, the colour in the concavities plunged me into the depth of water, caves, of shadows deeper than the carved concavities themselves. The strings were the tension I felt between myself and the sea, the wind, or the hills. And this work here, Pelagos, which means sea in Greek, is inspired by a particular view of a bay in St Ives where two arms of the land reach out and embrace the sea. And made just after the war in 1946, it shows the developing openness of her forms from the strict geometry of the 1930s abstraction. In the post-war period, Hepworth gained significant international recognition, representing Britain at the 1950 Venice Biennale and winning the grand prize at the Sao Paulo Biennial in 1959, the first British artist to do so. She also received major public commissions from her two sculptures at the Festival of Britain in 1951, shown here, reunited last year in the Hepworth Wakefield Gallery Garden. This is contrapuntal forms and turning forms. To the monumental and architectural works which were inspired by her belief in the central role of art in society. So you see Winged Figure from 1963 and Meridian from 1958, both commissioned for major sites in London. She died in 1975 in her studio home, which has since been turned into the Barbara Hepworth Museum in St Ives. And in 2011, the Hepworth Wakefield opened in her hometown of Wakefield in Yorkshire, with the Hepworth family gift as its central and permanent display of Hepworth plasters and prototypes of some of these major public commissions, furthering her legacy. Now, despite having a varied and long career, Hepworth's work has often been placed within two tight contexts: as a pioneer of modern abstraction in the 1930s alongside her contemporaries Nicholson, Moore and Garbo, and as part of the modern movement in St Ives, frequently associated with the Cornish landscape that of course provided her with essential inspiration. Accompanying a Tate Liverpool exhibition, Barbara Hepworth, a retrospective, in 1994, academic David Thistlewood suggested that despite the entrenched reading of Hepworth as a high modernist focused on form above all else, she could be viewed as, and I quote, an antecedent postmodernist, a relativist before her time. And this was because of the progressive way in which she merged complex multidisciplinary references and inspirations in the creation of her work. And it picks up on a statement written by Penelope Curtis, curator of that 94 exhibition and continuing Hepworth specialist, has been something of a guiding star for me in my work on the book and the exhibition. So Curtis wrote, "Even a cursory examination of her friends and their range of backgrounds shows that her story is rather more diverse. Hepworth's life is not simply about sculpture and her relationship with three men, Skeeping, Nicholson, and Herbert Reed, the critic. We could round it out by bringing in other disciplines, music, for example, and her friendships with composers like Michael Tippett and Priya Rainier were very important to Hepworth. Topical concerns must also be given more emphasis. Hepworth was interested in political events, occasionally became involved in petitions or fundraising campaigns, and was affected by them. It throws out a challenge to a new generation of critics and writers. Hepworth has now been definitely detached from Moore, Nicholson and Garbo. Discussion must now centre on her own terms and what they meant. To attempt to understand Hepworth necessarily involves placing her sculpture within its wider context, for to her way of thinking, the one depended on the other." And this has been a statement that I've returned to again and again in thinking about what a Hepworth exhibition and a book looking at her whole life must actually bring to our understanding of this amazing artist's work. So in curating the exhibition and writing the book, I've aimed to reflect Hepworth's multifaceted, interdisciplinary and networked approach to her art and life, shedding light on her interests in music, dance, poetry, contemporary politics, science and technology, her engagement with these fields through friends and networks, and how she brought together seemingly conflicted disciplines sometimes into one coherent philosophy of art and life. And I also wanted to draw out lesser-known elements of Hepworth's practice. Her carved sculptures are rightly famous, as we've seen, but her work in metal, textiles, theatrical set and costume design are less known, as well as her remarkably vivid and varied painterly practice, her drawings and her prints. And all of these things you'll see in the exhibition when you get to the gallery. So the first point I wanted to look at here was Hepworth's interest in engagement and politics. She was born in Yorkshire in 1903 and lived until 1975, a lifetime and career spanning many turbulent political events in the 20th century. Raised in a middle-class family, she credited her upbringing in the industrial town of Wakefield with providing her with a respect for the working classes. And she wrote in 1941 of her appreciation of, and I quote, "the ideas of agricultural workers, fishermen, small town officials, local Communist Party members, Labour members, officials, etc." Going on to say, "Only one thing I lack, and I know it, and that's contact with factory workers, but my knowledge of the mills in Yorkshire and 18 years' intimacy with all that goes with collieries and mills is alive in me." And that letter was written to Margaret Gardner, a political activist and writer who Hepworth once described as her one intimate friend, and it is their extensive correspondence that provided much direction and inspiration for the book and the exhibition. So in 1937, the year that this work was made, Hepworth contributed an essay to the book, Circle, an international survey of constructive art, in which she alluded to the political and social impact that she aimed to make with her sculpture. She wrote that constructive art moves us profoundly because it represents the whole of the artist's experience and vision, his whole sensibility to enduring ideas, his whole desire for a realization of these ideas in life, and a complete rejection of the transitory and local forces of destruction." End quote. These forces of destruction refer, of course, to the rise of fascism across Europe, from the Spanish Civil War to the mounting war rhetoric from Hitler's Germany, and Hepworth contributed to anti-fascist exhibitions around this time. She continues in her essay, "These formal relationships have become our thought, our faith. Waking or sleeping, they can be the solution to life and to living. This is no escapism, no ivory tower, no isolated pleasure in proportion and space. It is an unconscious manner of expressing our belief in a possible life. The language of colour and form is universal, and not one for a special class. It is a thought which gives the same life, the same expansion, the same universal freedom to everyone." During the war, she became increasingly politically engaged and desperate that society would learn from the mistakes of the recent past, and she wrote again to Gardner, "I'm sick of everybody praying in the national sense. If they must pray, I wish to goodness they'd pray for political guidance. I think, as a nation, we have got a sense of human rightness, but rather than give it a label politically, we would give it the lie. I can't forget, even in sleep, the awful loss of life. What hideous payment for deaf ears and blind eyes. I think all of us over 40 have a great debt to pay after the war. We simply must act clearly to save our children having to pay it for us. The difficulty is how and where to act. Where is the power and virility? I know so many people who talk or believe socialism, who sense hypocrisy and hate it, and yet who will indubitably, as in hypnosis, vote Tory next time." In 1944, the interim war government made moves towards what would become the post-war welfare state, forming the Ministry of National Insurance and publishing white papers on social insurance and National Health Service. Hepworth was increasingly supportive of the Labour Party, defining her political position at this time, quote, as atheist, vaguely socialist, in brackets, cum lab, cum lib, close brackets, definitely left, but unformed in doctrine. She became a member of the Labour Party in 1956, in part due to their position on nuclear weapons. By 1952, Britain had become the third nuclear power after America and the Soviet Union. The Labour Party called for a moratorium on nuclear testing in 1954, but the government continued to develop nuclear weapons, and Hepworth wrote in protest, quote, "To remain inert in this matter, or to argue over expediency, is to disbelieve in the power of good and the moral courage generated by affirmative action." She became an advocate for the campaign for nuclear disarmament, connecting the desire to protect life with her experience as a mother and as an artist. In 1961, she co-authored a statement signed by artists, musicians, and writers, saying, "Culture means the affirmation of life. There can be no true culture while we make stockpiles of nuclear weapons. They are the negation of life." In 1956, Dag Hammarskjöld, Secretary General of the United Nations, selected one of Hepworth's sculptures for his office, this work you see here, single form, and he wrote a poem inspired by it. And this started a correspondence that became a friendship. They met in London in 1958 when Hammarskjöld gave an address on the United Nations' diplomatic role in achieving global nuclear disarmament, and he bought this painting for his personal collection. Their friendship led to a major commission at the United Nations headquarters in New York, which proceeded in Hammarskjöld's memory after his death in a plane crash in September 1961. Hepworth made these two works fairly soon after hearing of his death, which both pick up the sort of shield-like form in the painting that he owned. And this form developed into the monumental single form, which was unveiled in New York in 1964. There you see her working on it on the left for scale. And then there she is at the unveiling in '64. And she spoke at the unveiling, the film of which is in the exhibition. She said, Dag Hammarskjöld had a pure and exacting perception of aesthetic principles, as exact as it was over ethical and moral principles. I believe they were to him one and the same thing, and he asked of each of us the best we could give. The United Nations is our conscience. If it succeeds, it is our success. If it fails, it is our failure. Throughout my work on single form, I have kept in mind Dag Hammarskjöld's ideas of human and aesthetic ideology, and have tried to perfect a symbol that would reflect the nobility of his life, and at the same time give us a motive and symbol of both continuity and solidarity for the future. The other passion that Curtis mentions in her call for a broader look at Hepworth was music. In 1952, Hepworth published Barbara Hepworth Carvings and Drawings, a monograph in which she wrote a series of insightful texts on her career to date, which have largely informed the way in which we've viewed her career since. And in concluding these texts, she wrote, in these very brief notes, I seem to have omitted everything that goes to make up my usual working day. These things are immensely important to me, perhaps more important than the things about which I have written. My home and my children, listening to music and thinking about its relation to the life of forms, the need for dancing as recreation, and where dancing links with the actual physical rhythm of carving, the intense pleasure derived from tools and craftsmanship, all of these things are daily expressions of the whole. And Hepworth credited her love of dancing music as coming from her mother. Gerda, you can see in the middle of that portrait of her as a baby. And she also played the piano. She won a piano scholarship when she was still at school. And this early work on the far there, the shadow dance, shows her interest in dance and movement, which was also taught in her school. Her love of music also was a point of contact with Skeeping. You can see them here, both staged photograph playing their instruments. And of course, as we saw, she had installed the baby grand piano in her Hampstead studio. In 1933, around the time that this photo was taken, she had written with some specificity about the closeness of abstract art to music. She wrote, Johann Sebastian Bach, and the rigorous heights to which his genius led him, perhaps unwittingly, call upon not only musicians, but all the artists of today to create by carrying on through a new leap across the centuries, in accordance with visions that are both more generous, human and fertile, and equally more mathematical and rationalized. The most abstract movements in the oeuvre of Richard Wagner, whose works were generally romantic but sprung from the mind of one who was both an initiate and a revolutionary, and frankly more conscious than Bach, are those in which the willful and non-representational music sets out to convey to us his optimistic idealist understanding of the world through negating pessimism. When compared to such yearnings for the idea alone, what can the purely impressionistic work of Debussy and his imitators be worth? Evocations of the sea, moonlight, rustling trees, reflections and images that can never match up to nature in its divine imperceptibility and superior creativity. In 1949, Hepworth made this work, Rhythmic Form, which puts this connection between abstract ideas and music into its physical shape. And you can see it's a single form, it's a person moving, it's pierced by a hole which, given its title, seems to connect a musical annotation, a pause. And this sculpture was shown at Hepworth's exhibition at the Lefebvre Gallery in London in February 1950, after which the composer, Priya Rainier, got in touch and they began to exchange letters. Rainier wrote to Hepworth about the exhibition, writing, I cannot think of other modern sculpture which contains an essence usually associated only with music of the highest abstract quality. Going on to say, You have already achieved the world to which one struggles so hard in music. In their subsequent letters, they discuss further this idea of the closeness between music and abstract art, or the physical properties of music, something normally seen as being ephemeral. Rainier gave Hepworth the score and a recording of Thomas Tallis's 40-part motet, Speminalium, writing in the enclosed letter, "Here is the immortal masterpiece by Tallis. It is right that you should have the score of this miracle of architecture in sound." And Hepworth replied, "I'm determined to understand something of the construction. I must unravel its simplicity and understand its complexity." Rainier also gave Hepworth the composer Stravinsky's book, The Poetics of Music, which became one of Hepworth's favourite books, and she wrote to Rainier, "Stravinsky's chapter on composition corresponds so exactly to the creation of form that a mere half a dozen words only would need to be changed to make it a statement on sculpture." In the same letter, she describes one of Rainier's compositions, Sinfonia da Camera, 1947, in very sculptural terms, describing it as a fine and strong work, indeed very stone-like. The 4 movements in echelon with vertical blocks and integrated vertical impulses and detail which excites me profoundly. And at times, she seemed rather envious of Rainier's medium, writing, "How much more absolute, reliable, and defined are the materials with which you create. There's nothing you cannot do with sounds. Infinite relationships." In the summer of 1950, Rainier came to stay with Hepworth in St Ives and started a tradition for Rainier of annual trips to St Ives, and eventually she got her own studio there. And Hepworth wrote to Gardner, "My friend Priya Rainier is staying with us. She is a very beautiful person with a rare intelligence and astonishing creative power. She has been composing in a corner of Turin Garden, somewhat disturbed perhaps by the odd rhythms of hammers. It is lovely to be in contact with music and so refreshing to talk about another medium." Now, the hammering that Hepworth referred to was the creation of contrapuntal forms, as we saw, one of Hepworth's Festival of Britain sculptures, this enormous carving in blue limestone. And you can see her beginning the carving in the studio there. Rainier actually composed a musical fragment called The Rhythms of the Stones, inspired by these odd rhythms of Hepworth gradually chipping away and creating these 2 forms. And of course, the title, Contrapuntal Forms, comes from a musical term, which Rainier may have advised. The other sculpture that Hepworth made for the Festival of Britain was turning forms, as we've seen, white concrete on a metal armature that revolved. This process, building up a dynamic form on a metal frame, was echoed in the way that Hepworth would begin to work in metal a few years later, in 1956, having spent over 30 years solely making sculpture through carving. And some of these metal forms of the 50s were again inspired by music. So you see here curved form pavan. Pavan is a stately quartz dance from the 16th century. And it's made using armature of expanded aluminium, which is then built up with plaster, worked on the surface, and in this case coated with molten zinc, metallized. This work was acquired by Wakefield the year that it was made, although Hepworth may not have been impressed with the process of metallizing plaster because it wasn't a process that she repeated again. But she did make another related work, Forms in Movement Pavan, which was cast in bronze in the same year. And you can see one of these in Hepworth's garden in St Ives here. And similarly, you have this sort of sense of movement and sort of echoing perhaps the stately dance of the pavan in the form. The same year, she also made a related work, Forms in Movement Galliard, in bent sheet copper. And in a notebook, she described the difference between the different approaches working in metal, showing a similar sensitivity to materials as she did when she was carving into wood or stone. So with bronze, in a notebook she wrote, fire, running metal, molten, passionate, arrested movement, inducement of sound and resonance. Whereas making works like Galliard, described as related rhythms of curves, instead of making this work experimenting with sheet metal, I bent and twisted the sheets under tension until I found out the nature of its construction and forced it to express what I wanted by its nature and not against its nature. Writing to Herbert Reed about her move to working in metal, she noted that part of the motivation was to find the solution to the problem, and this is a quote, how to extend the forms beyond the capacity of the stone and wood, how to swing up and outwards when feeling cannot be contained by the block. In addition to expressing ideas of music and movement, these works articulate Hepworth's religious feeling and spiritual life. Some sculptures from this period in metal describe a sense of ascension that has specific religious overtones. For example, here, ascending form Gloria. Of course, Gloria referring to Gloria in excelsis Deo, glory to God in the highest. And here you see it alongside related painting forms ascending. There's one of these works in the gardens in Edinburgh, so I'm sure it's a very familiar work to you all. The same year, she made Cantate Domino, again, O sing unto the Lord, and can see more closely in this work the idea of these sort of diamond shapes being two hands coming together in prayer, raising up. The 1950s had seen several significant personal losses for Hepworth. Her eldest son, Paul Skeeping, died in a plane crash in 1953, and Hepworth's father died in 1958. She wrote that she had found some peace in St Ives Parish Church following the death of Paul, and she created this beautiful elegiac mother and child in his memory in 1954. Hepworth clearly saw a closeness between art, music, and spirituality. In 1953, Hepworth, Rainier, and the composer Michael Tippett organised the St Ives Festival of Music and the Arts. Although conceived of as an annual event, the performances were quite costly and not many tickets were sold, so it was not repeated. However, Hepworth wrote in its defence in the local newspaper in October 1953, "The festival was originally conceived as an act of praise. For centuries, man has tried to offer the best that he could give to God, and by joining in this act of dedication with his fellow men, he has replenished his faith in the true values of life and work. In this century of great wars and political strife, men and women have endeavoured, through such festivals, to reach a better understanding with their fellow beings. Art is a universal language. Music has the power to unite us and transport our spirit." Hepworth returned to the idea of art as a direct expression of her spirituality, writing in Christian Science Monitor in 1965, the year this painting was made, "A sculpture should be an act of praise, an enduring expression of the divine spirit." Christian Science, for those who don't know, is a Christian denomination rooted in a biblical faith whose central text, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy, was published in 1875. One aspect Baker Eddy sets out within this is the distinction between the mortal mind, which perceives and can falsely prioritise the physical world, and the divine mind or God, which represents the true nature of existence, a spiritual singularity of which everything and everyone is a part. And this branch of Christianity was hugely popular at the turn of the century, when a new Christian Science church was being erected every 4 days. Hepworth's parents became followers of Christian Science, and as a teenager, Hepworth owned and inscribed her own copy of Science and Health, and she gave Skeeping a copy on their wedding in 1925. It was also a point of connection between Hepworth and Nicholson when they met in 1931, as he was also a follower of Christian Science. And the belief in the interconnectedness of all things chimed with Hepworth's ambition for art to speak a universal language and relate to all humanity. The focus on the spiritual rather than the physical world could be seen to parallel her move away from representational figurative art during the 1930s towards the world of ideas and abstract art. Though at times she professed to be an atheist or pagan, Hepworth continued to consult Christian Science practitioners during the 50s alongside her increasing ties with the Anglican Church. And in 1959, she connected the act of artistic creation with religious faith, writing, "Suddenly, either in unconscious acknowledgement of life or in the silent tribulation of overcoming despair, one lets in the divine force, and there is the work, inevitably complete, timeless, and unalterable." In early notes for this text, she had written of, quote, God or the universal laws of evolution. And I think it's quite interesting that she saw these two concepts as sort of interchangeable, which indicate the breadth of her spiritual beliefs. Notebooks in the 1960s show her returning to the Christian Science text, Science and Health, writing out passages in these notebooks that can be seen to relate to works like these, for example. One passage she wrote out reads, "The divine mind is in perpetual motion. Its symbol is the sphere. The rotations and revolutions of the universe of mind go on eternally." This is a passage of Science and Health. Another passage reads, "The circle represents the infinite, without beginning or end." And perhaps this explains the increasing use of circles and spheres in Hepworth's later works. The circle can also be read as in relation to space exploration. And of course, the 1960s was the decade of the space race, with the moon landings taking place in 1969. And Hepworth made a number of works that refer to celestial bodies at this time, Sun and Moon, this lithograph, or Discs with Strings, Moon, from 1969, in which she uses aluminium and strings, increasingly, continually experimental with materials. Hepworth was fascinated by these technological advances in both telecommunications and aviation. And this is her at the ground satellite station at Goonhilly, which connected with Telstar, saying, she wrote, "I find such forms of our technology very exciting and inspiring." In an interview of May 1966, she said, "I regard the present era of flight and projection into space as a tremendous expansion of our sensibilities, and space sculpture and kinetic forms are an expression of it. But in order to appreciate this fully, I think that we must affirm some ancient stability." The same year, 1966, she made this painting, which brings together geometry with its fluid gestural paint, and both refers to celestial bodies and space exploration, but also, through its title, Genesis 3, religion. And the synthesizing of scientific advances with spirituality is typical of Hepworth's inclusive philosophy. It is this expansive approach to articulating our place in the world and the complexity of human experience that I believe is one of the reasons why her work continues to be so relevant today. And I'll leave it there if there's any questions. I do hope that you enjoy the show.
Phone switched on. Hello. So we can take questions from the people in the room, and just to let our viewers online know that we can also take questions there. I'll keep an eye on the chat. So does anyone have a question to start?
Hello, thank you very much. That was exceptionally interesting. I wanted to ask, in terms of when she carved, and I found that very interesting anyway, did she always do it all herself? Or in the more, in the monumental instances, did she engage assistants, or did she have students to help her do those?
So she did it all herself for the sort of first half, say, of her career. I showed a picture of her with the enormous blocks for the contrapuntal forms, and that was the first time that she took on assistants. She took on 2 assistants at that time to help her with the kind of roughing out of the forms. So there's film footage where you can see her sort of painting onto blocks, and then so they would have done the sort of rough outline, and then but she always had the sort of final hand in doing the sort of details of her work. And I should say, actually, even in the kind of really monumental works like the single form for the United Nations, there's pictures of her working on the sort of model for that flat, and she sort of writes about or talks about attacking it with hammers and axes to kind of create the textures to it. So she was very hands-on, even when the scale was enormous.
Hello, am I on? Thank you for the talk. It was really good. I'm just wondering, how far did she ever exhibit widely in the States or in Europe, or was it the nature of her work was so enormous, perhaps that precluded that?
No, she absolutely did. Yes, she. There was a touring show, particularly in the mid-50s, that travelled to several locations all around America, and so she had sort of several exhibitions. Many exhibitions there in her lifetime. She obviously represented Britain in Venice, as I mentioned, in 1950, and was in Sao Paulo in 1959. And actually, the British Council sort of toured exhibitions of her shows through that later post-war period as well. So she's been exhibited quite widely, quite internationally. She referred to the travelling circus of contemporary art at some points in the late 50s. And it was one of the reasons why metal became a useful material for her to work in, because, of course, it's much easier to be shipping metalworks around than these kind of very temperamental woods that for which environmental and humidity and those sort of controls are much more important.
There we go. Thank you. So I wonder if I could maybe pass on some comments from our 200 people who are watching online. So we've had lots of very warm and lots of thanks as well. So somebody, Anne-Marie Stordow, said that she's in Wakefield, near to the gallery,
Great.
and it's a lovely experience to be able to listen to the lecture, and thank you so much. We've also had a comment from Emily McLean, who says, thank you very much for providing access to the event, very informative. So there's a question which has come in from somebody called World Expo. All interesting. What is the relevance of Hepworth's work today, and why are we looking at it today?
That's a very good question. So, I mean, that's one of the things that I wanted to do with this talk, is to show how actually these kind of points of interest, I think, are still very, very relevant from, for example, politics. You know, her comments on the United Nations, I think, are extremely relevant today. Her ambition for art to offer a kind of solution of connectivity, of bringing people together in times of great disturbance and turmoil, I think, is something that is incredibly relevant today. I also think that on a sort of more basic level, the exhibition at the gallery opens with these statement by Hepworth, these 3 forms that she said she was continually drawn to throughout her life: the single form, the 2 forms, and the enclosed form. And she talks about how these, for her, represent specific sort of emotional human experiences. So the single form being the figure in the landscape, you know, the experience of being in your surroundings, experiencing your surroundings. The 2 forms being the tender relationship of one living thing next to the other. So thinking about how we exist in the world, how we relate to other people, those important human relationships. I think it's one of the reasons why her work is so relevant today.
Okay, I'll go on to it. There's another question from the online audience. Pauline Williams has asked, how did she develop her understanding of metals and its potential for her art?
A good question. So she came to working in metal quite late, actually. Her peers like Henry Moore started casting much earlier. And I think part of the reason was that she didn't really like this idea of modelling something small and then handing it over to a foundry or a master craftsman to make larger. Because the idea of the human scale and the one-to-one interaction that we have with sculpture was so important to her, and it's one of the reasons why it's so wonderful to be able to go and see her work in the flesh, because that kind of bodily contact, the way you feel in your body when you're with the works, is something that's really important. So that when she did start working in metal, she sort of came to it with her very own way of working. So instead of modelling in clay, she has this process, as I mentioned, of creating a metal armature and building up plaster to create these forms which she can then work on. And even when she was carving into plaster for some of the larger works, they're all made at the same, this sort of finished scale, the one-to-one scale. So that's why we have the Hepworth family gift actually in Wakefield, because those plasters that she carved and that she worked on are the prototypes that we have in Wakefield, whereas the sort of finished bronzes in their editions are the ones you might see in the botanical gardens, like Roquefort and Porthcurno, for example. So I think that yes, she kind of developed a very unique way of working with metal that meant she still had that kind of hands-on process, she still had that one-to-one response, and it makes her works very unique, I think.
Fantastic. I wonder if there are any more questions in the room.
Thank you very much. I was wondering if you have a favourite work that's in the exhibition, and if you wouldn't mind telling us which and why.
It is a really difficult question. It's a surprisingly difficult question to answer, and I think part of that is because, I've been a fan of Hepworth for as long as I can remember, I think. And I know that throughout my lifetime I've found different aspects of her work appealing as I've changed and moved into different periods of my life. I mean, one of the things that I love about Hepworth as an artist so much is that her work is so varied, because she is constantly pushing her practice and trying to find new ways of expressing these kind of eternal, universal ideas. So you see her kind of moving from figurative to abstract, and then with strings, the language and metal, it changes all the way along. So it is quite hard to choose kind of the best. But I would say that at the moment, my favourite is Mother and Child from 1934, which you'll see in the show. And it's a beautiful carving of in a very sort of warm stone of a mother stone that has this tiny baby stone sat on its lap. I have two small children who are 2 and 4, and over the last few years, that work, I think, has really spoken to me about that connection with our children, how they remain part of us, but they must go on into the world on their own. And again, I think that I see that tenderness and that universal kind of spirit in that work particularly. So you can go and see it yourself.
Any other questions? Okay. I'll ask one final question then, and then shall we wrap up? I was obviously encourage everybody to go and see the exhibition at Modern 2. It will be wonderful. It's just open today. But I was going to ask you if any of our audience wanted to make a little road trip to go and see any of the permanent sculptures. Where would you recommend us going to?
Outside of Edinburgh. Well, please come to Yorkshire. The Hepworth Wakefield has, as I mentioned, has a permanent display of Hepworth plaster works there. But we also have Hepworth finished sculptures on display as well. So we haven't sent it all off on tour. We have a number of works. So I definitely think you should make the trip to Yorkshire. And also nearby is Yorkshire Sculpture Park, where you can see Hepworth works in the landscape. Really wonderful group of works, The Family of Man, which again kind of shows this expansive philosophy, such an ambitious work that you can see kind of sighted on a hill in Yorkshire. It's an incredible experience. And then, of course, if you can manage it, then you must go to St Ives and see her home museum there, and the works in the garden as she kind of laid them out. It's an incredible experience, and you really get a sense again of her kind of continuing creativity and philosophy there. So there's definitely a Hepworth holiday that can be done.
Sounds fantastic, thank you. So just to say thank you very much for our esteemed speaker today, Eleanor Clayton, and thank you to everybody who's joined us in person and online. This is very exciting, our first lecture back in the Lecture Theatre, so we're delighted to have you all with us, and thank you, everybody. Thanks.